morning. I'm Dr Shirley Pressler. I'm a chartered psychologist and a retired university lecturer, and I'm giving evidence, I believe, in a personal capacity.
And I'd like to ask first, can you confirm that you have signed the consent form and read the privacy documents and agree for this recording to be used for the purposes of the CEDAW People's Tribunal, CEDAW in law?
Yes, I have, and I do, Your Honour.
Great, thank you. Good. Now, please can you tell us what you knew about this notice of deferrals of the state pensions age for women under the State Pension Act of 1995?
Well, it came as a bit of a shock to me because I'm a divorced woman who was divorced on the basis of my state pension age being 60, apparently after it was unknowingly changed. So I did have a letter from the government when I was about 57 in 2012, which is at the back of letters that began and stopped and began and stopped. So most women, I think, who did receive information, like me, only received it after the second age rise. So that letter told me of 2 age rises. Prior to that, because I'm in the teachers' pension scheme, there was something added to the teachers' pension dashboard. I think around the time the dashboard was actually upgraded, it was launched and then it was kind of like set up properly, if you will. I was in my 50s, certainly, when I knew, but I did know that it was going to be 65 prior to the letter coming, but when the letter arrived, it was 66. That left me with difficulties mortgage-wise because mortgage companies would not accommodate that second rise.
Ah, right. Well, we'll come to, that leads on to what impact, if any, has this change had on you personally?
It's had a terrible impact on me because it's given me added financial problems post-divorce. I've had a knockback financially during my divorce in the late 1990s. Most of our wealth seemed to be in pension pots in my ex-husband's name. The judge seemed to think that my state pension age was 60. I didn't know that was wrong. There was a lot of money in pension pots in his name. So I missed out on that. And then I've tried to rebuild my life. It's quite complicated, really. I had to leave my employment just before I was 60, around that time. I lost my eldest son, and I can't really explain why I left my employment for legal reasons, but I can say that the glass ceiling does exist for women. The difficulty for me there was that I had a mortgage. So the money I expected to pay my mortgage off with from the teacher's pension, which I drew at age 60, which I have a shortfall on anyway, because I only accrued it from around my mid-40s. That money I had to use to survive rather than pay the mortgage off. I then had to sell my home, which was what I would refer to as my second family home. I didn't get the house from the marriage, and all my children had lived there at some point with me as young adults. And I had this real pressure at the age of about 65 that my mortgage term was coming to an end. I had to sell it. The mortgage company wouldn't accommodate another year to run on the mortgage. They were constantly reviewing it. My teacher's pension, which I'd drawn at age 60 and used the lump sum to exist on rather than pay all the mortgage off, that wasn't sufficient to remortgage. So that left me in a terrible dilemma. I was fortunate enough to sell that property, and I purchased a flat, which is where I now live. And I'm retired. I live in a flat, and from that point of view, I've been quite lucky.
Yes. What everybody knows, I think, is that if one is sufficiently fortunate to own one's own residence, even though there are rates, there are council tax, there are maintenance costs and so forth, it's so much more secure than having to be in the private rental market or even in the council market. So yes, But you see, what this actually illustrates too, it is the impact of divorce and the issue of property distribution on divorce and property valuing and contribution to property and assets in the course of a marriage, which is another issue, of course, to pursue under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. But just coming back to this issue, if we look at Parliament's role in this, because of course it was a government proposal, the pension age change, but Parliament participated in it because the Act wouldn't have come into existence without the Parliament. So are you aware of, or do you perceive of any measures that Parliament could have taken to remedy this problem, this issue, this impact?
Yes, I believe that they could adopt CEDAW into domestic law, which they've agreed internationally, and then any legislative changes they make have to be looked at, have to be viewed in terms of the consequences of those actions. And the consequence here is to make already disadvantaged women, who the government knew were a lot poorer than the men anyway, and cost less in the state pension system previously anyway, they've made them even poorer and even more disadvantaged. Now, the government knew that. So in terms of legislation, I believe that if CEDAW was adopted into domestic law, the remedy now would be full recompense, but going forward, they wouldn't be able to make those kinds of legislative changes that disadvantage a targeted group quite so disastrously.
Yes, and now in that response, you referred to the financial disadvantage of women, which I'm taking to relate to the gender pay gap. Are you able to talk about the gender pay gap and also its impact in terms of pension schemes? Because if there's a gender pay gap, does that have a consequence for a pay gap in the pension element?
Absolutely. So in terms of 1950s women like me, many of them like me will have begun working life when it was legal to pay us less than men for the same work. We contributed more in national insurance percentage wise to the system because we got our state pension age at 60. So that's just for the first few years of our working lives. In terms of the pay gap, then, the legislation for equal pay was decided in 1970, wasn't rolled out till the end of 1975, effectively 1976. I had my first child then, to give employers time to adjust, which as women I think we know, and I think some politicians will agree, was a way of allowing employers to find ways to let's just say, design roles for men and women where the women will still be paid less, most likely. I think a lot of the action was an undermining of what was supposed to happen to women legislation-wise. The problem is that the legislation is theoretical and the real lived experience of women or reality is about having a pay gap. The pay gap is actually calculated on the basis of median values, which is kind of an average value of pay per hour. Some people seem to think it's because women work less than men, which is just not true. Even in jobs like the one I've had working in a university, the union did some analysis at some point, and even though we have the same qualifications and years experience as men, and years taken out to look after children were factored out of this analysis. And on total equal pay scales, women still receive less pay than men. There are always ways and means to make sure that women have the disadvantage. So the pay gap then, in terms of pension contributions, obviously, if you contribute to something like the teacher's pension scheme, I have about half a working lifetime in it because I didn't achieve more promotion in my career. I then have a subsequent loss in terms of what I end up with in the teacher's pension scheme. So women, by way of being repressed financially in terms of pay are also repressed financially in terms of what they might get in terms of pension and lifetime wealth. Another anomaly really for us is that a lot of women, because of caring for children, etc., working around husbands' careers, etc., took part-time employment. And I think it wasn't till, was it 1993, that women were invited to join pension schemes from part-time employment. I think there was some change around that time. That coincided when I actually joined a teacher's pension scheme, but I was only half-time permanent. So in 1993, I was half-time permanent. Although I then had half-time employment for about 5 years before I got full-time employment, the 5 years in the teacher's pension scheme only counts as 2.5 years because it's out of time. But in terms of being contracted out from the state pension scheme, it counts as 5 times. That is an anomaly that applies to women. And there won't just be me. A lot of anomalies in terms of what happens in respect of women, and especially in old age, facing poverty. There are just so many things that trip women up. And the government knew about all this before they made the changes. This is what really is so annoying, actually. There are academics that were writing about this, and they use the government's own statistics, the ONS statistics, and have submitted some documents, academic articles. And somebody called Jay Ginn has written several of those. But in 1993, she demonstrated that although the government was saying they wanted to rely more on alternative pensions and perhaps diminish the state pension, they were looking at figures where married men had alternative pension provision and pretending women didn't exist. So she makes reference to invisible women, there's some reference to vanished women. And even though women might be married, there isn't an equal share of those pension funds. The research evidence suggests that. And certainly when you divorce, you kind of lose it practically. The legislation for automatic sharing only occurred in the year 2000, whereas taking state pension off women, which is basically what we're looking at, occurred in the year 1995. And then in 2004, there's been another change, which I've just detected, which impacts what defined benefit schemes pay out to men and women. I wasn't aware, and I'm not sure of the details, but women, it would appear, have a different calculation to men, presumably to accommodate this fact that we're supposed to live longer, and presumably to accommodate the fact maybe that we somehow retired earlier. I'm not quite sure how that pans out. But if you look at all the changes in legislation, pattern-wise, year by year, they don't follow a logical pattern, and they certainly do not favour women. So where the government have said they didn't have a duty of care to us in the previous judicial review, I find that quite interesting, because they obviously feel they have a duty of care towards men, because this change with the state pension scheme to address issues on behalf of men implies that there's a duty of care, but there's no duty of care towards women. Now, in the most stark financial comparisons I found in the Ginn article in 1993, when these were being planned, these changes, there's an illustration of where working level men and women did have alternative pension provision. A man would have £33 a week. In comparison, a woman would have £7. The government were putting all these changes into the pipeline, knowing that factual information, knowing that women face poverty in old age. They're reliant on diminishing the state pension. And one of the solutions that this government have suggested to us 1950s women during the challenges in Parliament is to rely on the welfare states. Yet at the same time that these changes came into force around the year 2010, the welfare reforms were put into place. The welfare reforms actually diminished the welfare state. So they're telling the same group of disadvantaged women to rely on something that they're messing around with, and you cannot rely on. I'm sorry, you're on my phone's going off. I'll just bring it off the hook. So I just personally find a lot of this, when I look at all the facts and information the government had available at their fingertips, evidence from people like women in positions of power in the Lords, House of Lords, saying you can't do this to women, they're the poorest people, why are we doing this to women just to save some money? What they've done with the National Insurance Fund, diminishing that as well, using it for other things. All of these changes and all these disadvantages for women have been socially constructed by men in power in Parliament. And I think there's a big problem with that.
Yes. I mean, you've raised a very large number of issues. I mean, one of them is the issue about divorce and superannuation and the consequences there, because what really needs to be looked at is the contribution that's a non-monetary contribution to that asset, because men would not be able to earn, apart from the inequality in terms of education and employment, promotion, appointment and so forth, men would not be able to earn what they earn if, generally speaking, if there were not a woman who was actually doing the support work, and her money is going on things like, if she's in paid employment, her money will pay for the childcare, her money will often pay for the holidays, her money will pay for the utilities. His goes into the superannuation and the mortgage, which are the two major assets that come out of the ordinary everyday marriage. And it's not properly recognised that the contributions that women are making are equal to the monetary contributions that the man's making. That's what equality is, and that's what equality means. But so that's a huge issue. And then, as you've also raised, the issue of the glass ceiling, which you mentioned earlier. And that impact, I also refer to the concrete canopy, which is the canopy over the women who are working in the factories, who can't even see the sky above them. And that's a huge issue there in terms of the jobs that women have access to and the payment rates for those jobs too. But look, I've just got another couple of questions I'd like to put. When your own pension matter arose, did you seek information or advice as to what you might do, or what the real implications were, or what the real rules were as they would apply to you? And if you did seek advice, what did it entail and what was the outcome?
Yes, I did, Your Honour, in two instances. So in 1993, when I secured, because I'd been a mature student, I was a traditional wife of the era that I come from. I had children, raised children, and then went into study as a mature student. So when I eventually secured this half-time permanent post in 1993, I was invited into Teachers' Pension Scheme. I spoke to that then to my ex-husband's financial advisor, who advised me to join the scheme because he said it is a good scheme. Sorry, this is the telephone. So he never mentioned that my state pension age was being changed. Nothing to do with that at all. Just joined the scheme, which I did. Like I said, I was in it for about 5 years. Then I finished a PhD, and then I got full-time employment around about 1998, 1999. Then that was away from home. But then when I got employment nearer to home and I felt more settled, around about the year 2000, the then university I worked for invited some financial advisors in about doing teachers' pension scheme top-ups. And I opted into past added years. Now, I don't recall anybody mentioning my state pension age had changed at that point. So this is in the year 2000. But I did sign up to buy back past added years beyond the age of 60, because a woman had challenged these schemes that forced women to retire at 60. And I do recall the detail of that. I recall meeting a woman who actually did union work, who was doing taking the challenge out. And she said, why should I retire at 60 when men get to work on to 65? That's another disadvantage, I guess, because you couldn't build up the same amount of pension if you chose to. And then they never said that my state pension age had been changed. That's in the year 2000. So this is after the divorce, after the financial settlement, after I was starting to rebuild my life, after I'd managed to finish off a higher qualification, after I'd secured full-time employment nearer to home. That is really quite tricky. And other than that, no, I had contact with financial advisors and they didn't refer to the fact that my state pension age had been changed or was being changed.
Right. Yes, and the judge didn't know either, you see, in your
No.
divorce. And yeah, and it's something that ought to have been made known as well to counsel and barristers and solicitors practicing in the area, because it'd be crucial for them in representing their clients that they had an awareness of that change. And so in fact the Bar Council and the solicitors regulatory body should have been made aware as well, so that they could inform their professional their professional people that they in turn represent. Yes, good. Look, just one last question then. You did refer to the need for a Women's Bill of Rights in the domestic law. Did you have any other comment that you'd like to make about that, the impact or the potential impact of a domestic Women's Bill of Rights for the United Kingdom?
I think going forward, I think that would help in terms of, so for example, there's another anomaly that women have to meet yet. These are younger women going forward. So in fact, of the 1950s women have had a national insurance contribution anomaly, in so much as women like me who now have 49 years contributions still don't get a full state pension because I'm contracted out. We had to still carry on paying national insurance contributions. So although I retired around about the age of 60, I had some health issues. I didn't get another job. It's hard to get employed in your 60s as a woman in particular. That's evidenced. That's well evidenced. I still had to get national insurance years covered. Unfortunately, I'm a grandmother, so I've got the home responsibility years. I have to put an application in every year for that. Why is it so difficult for women? It's always made difficult for women. So going forward now, younger women, and this is the awkward thing about all this is supposed to be about women being independent financially of men. But now, if you're in a wealthy marriage like the one I was in, your husband's, if you're a young woman now with children, your husband's level of income is taken into account as to whether or not you receive child benefit. And if it's over a certain level, you don't receive child benefit. If that's the case, you don't receive national insurance home responsibility contributory years. So a woman like me now, later in life, might discover that they haven't got all those home responsibility years because you haven't been receiving. What young women need to know is that they have to make a nil return application. Knowing they won't get any child benefit because of their husband's income, they have to make a nil return application. Presumably, if CEDAW was adopted at the domestic level, then that wouldn't be permitted, to make it so tricky for women so as to so disadvantage them. That has sometimes happened with older women. I've seen something on social media recently where a woman had no entitlement to state pension payment because her husband had received the child benefit in his name. Now, this was of a particular type of marriage from a particular position in society, and this is somebody who'd not always lived in this country, and the man obviously taking responsibility and sorted everything out, perhaps lovingly, but he was appalled that his wife wasn't entitled to a state pension because the child benefit had come in his name. So there's all these anomalies for women. Why? And in terms of my view of this, is because we have what we call a male lens view. Legislation is developed and the academic articles contain similar claims, evidence very well that we've got men in power who have a certain ilk, the patriarchy, and they use a male lens view, a male yardstick, and everything is written as if it's about what is referred to as the idealized working man. And anybody else who doesn't follow that life path isn't really accommodated for. So what I'm saying there is that legislation is not inclusive in terms of having anything other than the ordinary white middle class male path working life. So in terms of women and other people, presumably, then these discrepancies wouldn't be allowed to occur. The legislation would have to be more inclusive, which it obviously isn't. And in this case for us, it's just not considered us at all, which is why some of the academic articles refer to the legislation as being gender blind.
Yes, that's the issue about justice is blind, isn't it? That
yeah.
What happens is that the blindness operates where it oughtn't to, and the open eyes operate, it's around the wrong way, because sometimes there should be a blindness. For example, if there's a promotion, then it should be blind to whether it's a woman or a man, so that the woman's got equal chance, and the fact that she's a woman is not used against her. And yet that doesn't happen. It's obvious from the way that the system works. And yet when women should be seen in the landscape as women, then they're not, because, for example, if we look at the health sphere, what tends to happen is that health programs and so on tend to be worked out on the basis of the male category rather than the female, and so on. But yes, are there any final comments that you'd like to make before we adjourn?
I think I would, Your Honour, thank you. One thing I haven't mentioned is what alternative plans there might have been instead of these changes as they are. And there's good evidence in health psychology, lifespan psychology, and in other arenas that retirement should be based on healthy life expectancy and not life expectancy, absolute life expectancy. And what people need to understand is that life expectancy in any form only accommodates 50% of the population. So a government minister recently has referred to us 1950s women as, oh, life expectancy is 83, therefore a woman born in the 1950s can expect to live to 83, which is just not true. She has a 50% chance of getting there. But I really want to focus on healthy life expectancy. So when these changes came to my notice, I asked a local councillor, why didn't they just average the age between men and women of 65 and 60 to make it 62 and a half? Unbeknown to me, I assumed that would cost the same. No. Men tend to qualify for more in the state pension scheme, which they still do. So, you know, this is not a betterment for women at all. It's making things worse for women. So 62 and a half actually accords with roughly where healthy life expectancy falls. Now, also, instead of doing the rise as they have done for us 1950s women, I think we get to age 66 over a 4.5 years date of birth span. What the government could have done is to just do, I think it would be roughly a 6-month rise per year date of birth. And I think that would leave us in the 1950s with a state pension age of 62 and a half, which is again around healthy life expectancy. And also another alternative they might have considered is something I have on my Twitter profile, and I've submitted it along with some of the academic articles and the presentations that I've produced, is something that followed the narrowing of the pay gap. The Fawcett Society in, I think it was 2017, said it's going to take 62 years from 2017 for the pay gap to actually narrow significantly or meet up. But I did a rough graph of the changes, and had the government instead followed a narrowing of the pay gap in the future and sort of followed lines drawing together at that point, the women born in the 1950s would have had a state pension age around about 62 and a half, or it would have been capped at that. Again, that's around about healthy life expectancy. But what I would support is what some of the academics support, and that is, in terms of also the evidence the academics point to, is what the general population support. The general population do not have any problem with an intergenerational sign of solidarity in terms of supporting younger people paying for older people when they age. The crisis financially is not as the government have portrayed. The boom in older people is not as the government have portrayed. There is no real crisis, and public popularity is to have a proper, reliable state pension. The problem with private pensions and now auto-enrolment is that they are not value for money because fees are taken out of them. There are costs associated. And as we all know, the original legislation for us 1950s women was piggybacked on the Maxwell legislative changes, where Maxwell had sort of pension funds had disappeared. I believe British Home Stores funds have disappeared since. So there's been some tweaks and changes that are kind of, I would say, tokenistic in that sense. But our changes were piggybacked on those changes. And I think it's a bit ironic that we're expected to rely on other things that don't work well for us. They feed a financial industry rather than people who invest in the pension schemes. So the academic writers write about this as well. And what I would suggest is something promoted by another campaign group, actually, which would be to have an equal payout, living level state pension, which is very robust and securely funded and payable to everybody from age 60. And I think that would be a good way forward. And having all these anomalies for women, there do seem to be a lot of things that trip us up, confirms for me, and these changes confirm for me, that we've got too much male bias, the male lens view, residing in Parliament. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pressler, very much appreciated. And just before we go to our adjournment for lunch, the three witnesses that we've had in this session, Carol May, Pauline Hinder, and now Dr. Shirley Pressler, have brought to mind Article 12 and Article 13 of CEDAW. Article 12, states parties shall take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in the field of healthcare in order to ensure, on a basis of equality of men and women, access to healthcare services, including those related to family planning. And paragraph 2 says, notwithstanding the foregoing, states parties shall ensure to women appropriate services in connection with pregnancy, confinement, and the postnatal period, granting free services when necessary, as well as adequate nutrition during pregnancy and lactation. I'm referring to this one because in terms of health, this was an issue that particularly came up through Pauline Hinder's contribution, her evidence to the tribunal, the health impact of this change to the state pension age. And then in Dr. Shirley Pressler's evidence, she's referred to the situation of younger women coming up who are having a family and the impact, therefore, on the contributions that are being made by them to the state pension, but to other possible schemes. And this issue of the impact of having children was also raised by the other two witnesses. And then to Article 13, states parties shall take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in the areas of economic and social life in order to ensure, on a basis of equality of men and women, the same rights, in particular, A, the right to family benefits, B, the right to bank loans, mortgages, and other forms of financial credit, and C, the right to participate in recreational activities, sports, and all aspects of cultural life. Now, each of these issues was raised by our witnesses. For example, I remember very clearly Carol May speaking about how she wasn't even able to go to the films on the odd occasion now, because of the financial impact that's come about because of the changes to the Pension Act. And of course, the earlier pay gap and the pensions gap that would have accrued in any event, notwithstanding these changes. So these changes have simply impacted hugely on what was already a discriminatory situation for women. And in terms of the family benefits issue, this was just now raised by Dr. Pressler. and the right to bank loans, mortgages and other forms of financial credit. Of course, if in 1986, when this country had ratified CEDAW, if it had actually introduced domesticated CEDAW at that time with a Women's Bill of Rights, at least action would have been taken, one would hope, because the law on paper, as the point's been made, is not the law in action, but once it's on paper, it can be acted upon. But the issue about bank loans, mortgages and other forms of financial credit has been a huge disadvantage to women in the survival stakes. So this is what are issues that arise out of the tribunal today, the CEDAW People's Tribunal, looking at women's pension rights, particularly in the context of the changes to the Pension Act of 1995 to and also 2011.